Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones, and so glad you could join us today. We're continuing our study into the Daodejing. We are entering chapter 37, and this is an interesting one in that you'll recall the title of the Daodejing is Daodejing, and the reason they do that is there's essentially two main sections of the book. The first section is focused on Tao. It's not like it's exclusively one or the other here, but and the second section is typically focusing a little bit more on Da. Now, these sometimes are found in ancient manuscripts in reverse order. And so you can actually get a copy of what's called the Daodejing, which is looking at one of those earlier manuscripts that follows that order. But what we're looking at today with chapter 37 is the conclusion of the section on Tao. And it is either the transition point between Tao and Da, or it's the conclusion of the book, depending on which order you're working with. So it's a bit of a significant chapter, even though at first blush it might seem rather simple. There's actually a fair amount going on, which is a common occurrence when we're looking at the Tao Te Ching is things that can appear very banal on the surface turn out to be quite significant once we dive into them. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in. It starts by saying Tao does nothing. And the actual phrase here is kind of interesting because it's saying Tao Chong. And if you remember the chapter 1, there's the concern about the Tao that's the constant Tao, and the constant that's being used there is Chong. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but what we have here then is saying Tao Chong. So it could be Tao constantly does, or the constant Tao, or something along those lines. We're getting back to that kind of root core concept of Tao. And then the does nothing is again bringing up that phrase Wu Wei that we've looked at a couple of times. So Wu Wei is literally like absent or not doing, which is where it gets translated here as does nothing. Now, we've tried to make a point of identifying that this isn't a situation of that there is nothing that actually happens, which we see here in the second phrase, yet nothing is left undone. The way portion of it, that action portion, is usually concerned with the idea of socially constructed or derived ways of doing things. So like that social convention. And we've seen a lot of critique within Taoism about that social conditioning about how someone is supposed to act, and that they're looking for something that's more spontaneous. And that spontaneity is either going to come more from like that human nature aspect, which is where they refer back to that young child or the baby before it's been influenced by culture, how it just responds naturally or spontaneously. But they also look at cultivated spontaneity, and this is where you develop the kinds of skills where you can become virtuous at something without having to think about it. So in the same way that we learn how to drive a car, and initially there's a lot of work that goes into figuring out how the stuff works, especially if you're, doing a manual transmission, eventually all that just becomes background. It becomes second nature, so to speak, and you don't have to think about it. It just happens. That would be a form of cultivated spontaneity. So here they're making the point again that the Tao is not this cultivated way of doing things. It is more of that natural way of doing things. And we've seen that when they're talking about Tao is in terms of way, that it's not simply another human offering of how to be in the world, a way of being. It is looking at that more, let's say, cosmic level of how does everything work? What are the patterns of the universe that you can't actually not follow? which is, again, getting back to the beginning of chapter 1, the Tao that can be followed is not the constant Tao, because something like, say, gravity, which would be an example of this cosmic way, it doesn't matter if you're ignorant of it or if you don't agree with it, you can't help but follow it. There's no way to not follow it. So here we have this idea that there's a way of the universe that is not derived from cultural norms. And even though it's not, in a sense, manufactured, everything still happens that's supposed to happen. So if we think about where we've talked about this idea of determinism, this idea of cause and effect, here we see, in a sense, this being laid out, that there's a way of the universe that's not derived from anything else. It's just kind of base, and that it will unfold and do everything that's supposed to happen. Nothing will be left undone. So this would be kind of our opening recap of a great deal, really, of Taoist thought. And when I say Taoist, I'm restricting this to Daodejing, or philosophical or classical Taoism. So within this context, it's really summing up a great deal of what their basic point is. There's a way of the universe that we refer to these patterns as Tao, as that way. It's not derived by humans. It's not socially constructed. And even though you don't have humans intervening, everything still happens. Everything still unfolds the way it's supposed to unfold, without that intervention. So with that initial salvo across the bow here about how things are, it's going to go to the next step and say, if lords and kings could grasp this. So we're very quickly reminded that this book is dealing with a historical context of the Warring States period, and it's really focusing on the question of the social chaos that is happening at that time as a result of something that the lords and kings are doing wrong. And here they're saying if they could get a hold of the way that Tao functions and incorporate that into what they do, if they could grasp this and start to mimic it, then it's going to have some effects. And in this case, they're saying that the 10,000 creatures, so this is all of the things that are actually manifest when we think about that way that the Tao, within that worldview, they have Wu, which is absence, and they have Yu, which is presence. And there's this movement between the two where this undifferentiated form then becomes with form. And that's referred to as the 10,000 things, or in this translation, they say the 10,000 creatures, of which we are one. So if the lords and kings could grasp this, the 10,000 creatures would transform themselves. This would be kind of the natural evolution, the natural development that would normally happen. And so the implication here is that the role of lords and kings, and this is important to understand, this idea of the emperor isn't challenged within the Tao Te Ching. It's not the idea that we need to get rid of all rulers. It's not a call to anarchy. It's a call to how should that rulership happen appropriately. And so in this case, there's something they should be learning from the way that, from nature, essentially, the way of nature, the Tao. How does nature do what it does? And if they could implement that, then all those underneath them within the empire would naturally flourish in the ways that they're supposed to. So the Daodejing is famous for not giving us a whole lot of feedback on exactly what that looks like, which on one hand is frustrating, but on the other hand is what makes it so timeless, because it's giving us a paradigm or a methodology that we can use to continuously refine what that might look like without getting dogmatic about specific things. And this is actually very helpful for us, because now there's a whole nother way we can look at it, without getting caught up in, well, you're not doing this the way that they said to do it 2,500 years ago. So that's a key benefit, I would say, of how the Daodejing is structured. So one of the things we might observe in terms of if they're looking to nature to understand how they should structure how they govern, one of the key things that we say all the time is that the Tao, those patterns in nature, are inviolable. If you can't not follow gravity, there's no exception to the rule. If you're going to do something like flying, which seems like it violates gravity, it's only because you're actually working with gravity that you're able to accomplish that. So the concept then is twofold. One, the way that they structure things should be at the level of things that should always happen no matter what, no matter who. So if we think about in more modern language, this idea that everyone is equal before the law, kind of a concept. And if we go back to the chapter 5 of the Tao Te Ching, and when it says, gives a comparison between heaven and earth and how they function, one of the key points they bring up is that it is inviolable, that there is not a way that there, or not inviolable, that's not the right word, but they are, what's the word? They're impartial, right? That they don't make judgments that give maybe alternate ways that things are carried out. Everything is consistent. And it says that the sage then follows that same role in terms of not being a judge between people in this case. Now, if a ruler were to start to structure the way that they do their rulership based off of what they're observing from nature, that would create a structure in which things are allowed to flourish. There's a potential drawback to this, and that is it could lead to desire. Now, we want to be clear. Again, Tao Te Ching is not one of these texts that's trying to say that desire is something you're supposed to get rid of in general. Everything functions from desire. It's a question about the right kinds of desires. And in the context of this passage, it's getting to the desire of the king or the lord, right? Or the emperor. So if in the course of structuring things properly, he suddenly has everybody being a willing follower, which would be a key thing. Again, if we think about the Warring States period, if people are not willing followers, then what do you have to do? You have to coerce that behavior. And if you're coercing that behavior, you run the risk of resistance or even rebellion. And that would be one of the key critiques that they have of what's happening in the Warring States period, is that you are taking a wide variety of people and trying to get them to conform to a particular way of being. And they very colorfully use this idea of carving wood, this idea of how do you get them to fit. But the problem is that there's going to be resistance to that. And so there's always this movement of how do we get back to this idea of uncarved wood. But let's say the ruler is effective at creating a context in which people are willingly following, and it's bringing about this flourishing, this natural transformation. The risk here is that the leader might start to get some ideas like that there's, now I've got this position of control, I've got all these people following me, look at what I've been able to do with my empire. And that's where things can start to go off the rails, because if that leader then starts to get some ideas that are contrary to Tao, now it's going to lead to social dysfunction. We're going to go back to that idea of coercion, because we've moved into a realm now where it's not about what is the common good, but what is the emperor's good? What is the desire of that leader? So the response to that is, and it's interesting here that it says I. And I really checked into this because some of the translations will include I and others don't. but that is actually the character in Chinese for I in this case. So I don't know if we want to understand this as like the sage instructing the ruler, or what the sage would do if he was the ruler and this started to happen, or something along those lines. It says, I would suppress it, and that is these desires that are tempting me to go outside the bounds of what that emperor should be doing in terms of getting caught up in my own ideas as opposed to what makes for the common good. He says that it would be that the process for how you would suppress that is by using nameless simplicity. Now, this word for simplicity is pu, which is again that word for uncarved wood. And nameless is another way that, in a couple of different points in the Daodejing, that actually refers to the Tao as nameless. So it's a return to understanding this nameless, which also could be thought of as without rank, right? So we think about just our place in the realm of the 10,000 things. We think about how those 10,000 things have their natural or spontaneous way of being, and that we want to return to incorporating that diversity as opposed to, again, trying to carve it to get it to conform to particular individuals or communities' idea of what they should be. How that then referring to and reflecting back on this process would be how the leader would then curb those desires or those temptations to take this role and use it for personal gain as opposed to the common good. So I'm going to pause for a second here before we go to the conclusion, because I kind of talked here for a little bit. What are your thoughts on how they're laying this up so far? What do you think of this idea of modeling the Tao in terms of how leadership should function and the problem of personal interest with the leader?
They're making it seem like it should be effortless, but it seems like it's actually pretty hard to to be so neutral about everything and just let go, you know? It easier said than done, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that it was really uh, uh, intuitive or valuable that they identify here this idea of leading to desire when you find yourself in that position. But it also goes back to this idea of personal cultivation and how do we incorporate that into ourselves, especially if we are somebody who's in a position of rulership.
Yeah, I feel like it's even harder if you're in leadership because you have so many people influencing you and trying to advise you and so much pressure to do the right thing. And not everybody is going to agree with you, obviously, because everyone's different. Um, so no matter what you do, there are going to be some people that don't agree, and it's hard to be so neutral with all of that orbiting in your head. I feel like.
Yeah. One of the other areas that this kind of alludes to is, again, using our modern language, this idea of equality before the law. What do you think about that idea that it should be applied equally for everyone?
That the law should be applied equally for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Martin has some thoughts. It looks like.
I have thoughts, yeah, on this particular one. I think that it doesn't today and in one direction, but I think it shouldn't, but in the other direction. Like there is a lot more as we always talk about you're a product of your environment. Um, there are areas where one should be held more accountable to the law than the others, depending on the circumstances. I think that the equal punishment for everyone is just not necessarily suitable. I mean, in general, like yes, we all should be, without exception, applicable to the, or subject to the law, but when it comes to actual judgments and the punishments themselves, those should be tailored specific to specific areas, specific circumstances, which I don't think is happening these days.
Yeah.
I
So
think there's a lot of nuance, like depending on what happened and the intent behind it and all of that.
So our laws can do things like take intent into consideration as part of the law, right? That can still be a part of it being equally applied. But what do you think in our modern situation are the reasons why it is not equality before the law? What's going on that is causing that to be different?
Well, actually, I've answered your previous question, Jim, which is
Sure.
that a law, a human set of human laws, legal system, justice system, whatever you want to call it, that applies equally to everyone is more like the natural law, the Tao, which applies equally to everyone and everything. So the more equal the human law is in that sense, the more it's like natural law.
Mhm. Exactly. So one of the benefits he's saying of natural law is it's always the same. And if, as somebody subject to natural law, which we all are, the more we understand what that is, then we can learn how to work within that context and accomplish things and go about doing the things that we're striving to do because we understand, in a sense, the constraints. Excuse me. So when we get into human social structures, we still have a situation where we have to understand what those boundaries are and how do we work within it. But if those boundaries are inconsistently applied, then that leads to all sorts of, again, resentment. Why is it that, my brother went to jail for 3 years for a DUI or something? And I'm just making this up. My brother didn't do that. But let's just say, family member went to jail for 3 years for a DUI, but, the president's son gets a DUI and nobody finds out about it, right? That causes that resistance. Why is there an inequality in terms of how laws are being applied in things like one of the key areas in current discussion? I don't know what's going on with my throat here. Hold on. We can look at, that didn't help, the issues of things like drug use and where we see that very unevenly applied and usually along racial divisions. And so there is a problem with the way that we're setting up those boundaries. And in a certain sense, we could say those boundaries are almost arbitrary. I mean, obviously, we want them to be according to this larger picture, things that are going to allow for this natural flourishing to happen. But assuming that those laws are something around those lines that are designed to help that flourishing happen, if they're not equally applied, that's going to create social chaos as well. And the question then is, according to this, or even our own observations, what are the attributes or the practices that happen within a society that causes the law to be unequally applied?
Well, the stratification of wealth, obviously, power, for physical force, as I've heard Daniel Schmachtenberger say, physical force is deeper in the stack of power than wealth. But if you consider two forms of power, there's physical force that comes out of the barrel of a gun, and there's financial, monetary power, and it's pretty much impossible to keep money from capturing the levers of politics so far.
So what is what's happening with money? How is money corrupting the system?
Money accumulates based on a power law distribution, much like matter in the universe and many other things that have the property of, like the way a planet forms is there's a little bit of matter that comes together, and then the gravity draws some more matter to it. The more matter there is, the more gravity there is, and then eventually you get like a solar system.
Mhm.
Because where it's clumped more tightly together, then it draws more to it. Money is the same way. Where money is more concentrated, it draws more money to it. So money is distributed by a power law distribution where 90%, 10% have 90%, or 20% have 80%, that kind of distribution, which means that the levers of power are susceptible to the whims of those who control concentrated wealth.
So let's say I'm somebody in that 10% that has a bunch of money that I can do something with. How do I use that to alter the execution of the law?
By influencing, I mean, well, in all kinds of ways. If if your son gets arrested, maybe you um, have it so the police don't press charges, or if they do press charges, you have it so that they don't go to court. Or if it does go to court, you have it so that it stays out of the news, or uh, on basically every stage of the process where human influence is involved, where people can be motivated um, by incentives of one form or another,
There you
which
go.
are linked to wealth. So you made control over incentives, to put it simply.
Yeah. So it's getting back to, if you had a bunch of money and I'm the guy that's in charge of the jail and you want me to let your son out and you're like, here's, $10,000. And I say, no, thank you. It doesn't work, right? It doesn't actually get you anything. The only way it works is because it's appealing to something in myself as the guard, that there is a desire for something, right? So there's some kind of personal benefit that I'm looking at. I'm not looking at the common good. I'm looking at, oh, here's a pile of money that I could get that then I could use for something. So here we see how desires enter into the problem of being able to be effective in how things are executed. And the challenge with money then is that it can play off those desires if they exist. If the person is sufficiently cultivated where they have a way of looking at the world and at their role and the importance that it has in such a way that you can't bribe them, then the money doesn't do any good. You have to find somebody else that you can try to bribe or entice with those funds. So we're back to this idea that for those who are in positions of power or leadership, it's the practice of their desires in a way that are inconsistent with that common good if their role is in some form of government then, or how the legal system is executed, that is getting in the way. And that can be looking out for personal gain, which we see a lot of how political office is used for that personal gain, and especially because, at least in the United States, how we've allowed money into the political system. But you also have other types of things that cause people to look at changing the way laws are executed. And one of them, which you would think would be a very noble trait, would be this idea of loyalty. So loyalty, this is my buddy. I owe him something. I'm going to get him out of this mess. Or it could be, as we've talked about before, family relationships. Oh, that's my son. I'm not going to let that happen to him. Right. So we've got some key areas that are detrimental to social cohesion when they come into play at this governing level. And those are going to be my own personal agenda which are these desires that could be influenced by things like money or other things, or even just, what can I do with this power that I have in terms of leadership? It can be, and again, what are my personal interests as opposed to the common interest, but also my family relationships and my sense of loyalty to other people can all get in the way of how that would be carried out. So now when we think back to chapter 5, which seemed like such a harsh chapter when it says that heaven and earth are not kind, therefore the sage is not kind, we're getting into these issues of those value judgments, those personal self-interest questions, and how those are very detrimental to something like social cohesion. And yes, this could be like at a government level, but this can be in any kind of context where there's social arrangements, from a club to a business to, whatever, a religion. All those kinds of social arrangements can be very subject or suffer from these kinds of human ways of being if they're allowed to be part of that system. And the Taoists are arguing the way you get around that is you have to come back to how does nature do it in a sense, right? That gravity is gravity and it's just across the board. It doesn't matter how much money you have or how much power you have, you're still subject to it, right? And their idea is if we could somehow get our leaders to recognize this and implement it, and as something like desire creeps up inside them, how do we curb that? By having these practices of self-cultivation to understand their position, not just from a self-oriented perspective, self-centered type of a position, but elevated up to the level of Tao, right? Of looking at the whole and how not only myself, but everyone is all a part of this bigger system, not the focus of the system. Then those would be the mechanisms by which they're arguing we could bring greater social cohesion to social institutions. Does that make sense? And then do you think that that's possible?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Don't think it's possible.
Jim, there's a sort of dichotomy that I'm thinking of that you seem to be illustrating one half of, which is if we're talking about like our elected officials, politicians, public leaders, and whatnot, you're saying they need to have this process of like inner cultivation so that they can be virtuous people essentially and execute their office in accordance with natural law, which is kind of the individual perspective of like we need better leaders and politicians, etc. We need better people to do whatever, like we need better teachers, or we need better police officers, or better medical workers, or whatever. And then there's the systems perspective of multipolar traps, which is like in a corrupt political world where everybody's trying to get ahead. If you want to be able to influence the political system, you have to be able to survive inside the political system, which means that you have to compete with people who are using underhanded tactics and thinking self-centeredly and so forth. And there's also the legitimate line of reasoning that, oh, if I wasn't doing this, then somebody else would be. Like if I wasn't ripping off these taxpayers, then some other politician would be doing it. I might as well be the one who benefits from doing it, because then maybe I can have a chance of implementing some positive reforms in the future. So independently of how the individuals cultivate themselves, there's also the systemic structure of the thing, which is even a virtuous person would still be influenced by the the structural mechanics of the system that would influence their decision making if they were rational, and make it so that to some extent, if you weren't a little bit self-centered, you wouldn't even be in that arena at all, and you wouldn't be able to influence it.
Yeah, it's a challenging situation when you're already in a context, right? It's not like you're starting from scratch. How should we plan the society, and what are the rules, and how do we want to hold our leaders accountable to those rules? We're already in the midst of something, and how, where do we go from here? And I think the same thing would be happening in their context, right? Because the primary social system of the empire has devolved into the feudal lords battling each other for power. And so they're in an extreme case of chaos. And maybe, the motivation behind those different feudal lords was just like you're saying, this is the system we're in. We got to play the game if we're going to get into a position of power where we might be able to have influence. And this is, I would say, one of the constant temptations is if I could just get a seat at the table, then I could, help to affect change. The problem is going through that process of compromise that gets you to the table, then you're in a compromised position where even if you had good intentions, now it's very difficult to implement them because maybe you're indebted to people who have vested interest that got you there in the first place, or you are falling prey to what is very common in human nature, to this idea, now I'm in a position of power, I can do what I want. So the other method then would be, instead of trying to take control of the system, is in a sense to overgrow it. And I kind of like this idea of overgrowing the system as opposed to overthrowing the system. And I've seen some things like this even within our own culture. One of the most profound social shifts in terms of being truly radical within recent time, I think, and I'm referring here to the United States, was the transformation that happened in terms of the public discourse on same-sex marriage, where it felt, in a certain sense, it was almost like overnight it went from being accepted politically to not allow that, or to be on the side against it. And then all of a sudden everything changed across the board. It didn't mean everybody was of the same opinion, and there were certainly people who had differences, and still there's discussion and argument and how that gets played out legally and so forth. But socially, there was a massive shift. And that didn't happen from the top down enforcing something. This had to do with much more of a social change in perspective that, kind of hit that tipping point. Whether it was, that there was a certain number of people, or some kind of zeitgeist, spirit of the age type of an idea. It looks like it probably was something that happened more through media, where people were able to see themselves from the perspective of somebody wrestling with those issues. I remember probably the first thing that really struck me in that regard was a movie called, I think it was called Philadelphia. Was it Philadelphia Story or just Philadelphia? I can't remember. It was a legal case. But
Yeah, I think it's the Philadelphia Story from 1940.
no, it's not that early.
Hmm.
Wasn't it like Tom Hanks, I think, was the lawyer? And yeah, anyway,
Oh yeah, just Philadelphia.
just Philadelphia. Yeah.
Yep.
So it really got people thinking. And then you saw a
Dating
bunch.
yourself a bit there, Jim.
A little bit of an older guy. Yeah. Not 1940s old, but
1993.
93. But then you started to see a bunch of other movies that came out. One that was, documenting what happened to Harvey Milk, and just a number of things where people were able to suddenly put themselves in other people's shoes and see things from a different perspective that opened up that imagination to be able to conceive of what this is all about. It's really easy to have ideas about things when you don't know anybody who's wrestling with that, or it's not part of your world. But when that opens up, it can transform whole cultures without actually influencing it from the top down. And that would be kind of an example of this overgrowing the system that brought about the change, not because somebody got their seat at the table, but because it was just this groundswell of feeling that changed things. Not an easy thing to do, and it doesn't happen very often, but it might be the more sustainable way to get to transformation that we're talking about here with Tao, in that if it is a natural outgrowth, a natural way of flourishing, that's going to be extremely attractive and people are going to be drawn to it. So if leaders see that happening, I'm sure this is why the political positions shifted, because they saw what was happening with the people. Anyway, just some thoughts, but it's not a simple solution by any means in terms of how would this kind of change happen. But I do think, going back even to something we talked about before as well, this complexity theory, that what seems like a vast organized system can sometimes simply be very local in its arrangements in terms of how the individual pieces are just relating to each other. And that when those kind of patterns just kind of replicate, it becomes a much larger thing that looks like it's all orchestrated from the top down, but it's not. It's just all the different pieces are just interacting with each other according to some basic ways of being. And I think those are how some of those more significant social changes can happen, and where even our own personal cultivation of these practices will have an impact on those around us. And it has that ability to spread and bring about change, maybe kind of along the lines of Gandhi, where he was saying, be the change you want to see in the world. So here's the conclusion then. Nameless simplicity, that idea then of the Tao and the uncarved wood, that when we incorporate that, when we focus on that, it helps to eliminate those personal desires in terms of how we're trying to, if we're in positions of leadership, look at it from a position of personal gain versus common good. And if we can get to the point where we're not operating from that position, this is the key that they're trying to get at. All is peaceful and the world settles itself. It's a challenging concept because a lot of our way of looking at the world is that if we didn't have strong controlling leadership, it would be chaos. And that to avoid that chaos, to avoid a world of Mad Max, let's say, that we need some kind of strong government to prevent that from happening. But so often that narrative that we're hearing in that regard is designed to be justification for why we have, the extreme leadership in the first place. It's basically saying that without us, it would be chaos. Well, is that true? It's a tough call, right? And people are scared to find out. But I think there's ways that we can, again, implement, even at a personal level or at smaller communities or groups that function in a certain way, that can have a profound effect, because it can catch hold. It can transform the imagination and the possibilities in people. If right now our imagination is shut down because all we can imagine is a world of utter chaos, if there wasn't this dictatorial forms of control over social behavior, then we're not going to be able to get anywhere, because we can't imagine anything different. But potentially through personal example, personal experience, small communities experience, maybe becoming bigger communities, there can have that effect of transformation. So I think this is actually a really fitting conclusion to the first part of the book, or even a conclusion to the book if you reverse the order, of the two sections. How'd you like this last chapter?
This seems pie in the sky for me. You know, like, would probably be nice, but I don't see it happening.
So do you think the unrealisticness of it is because you would agree with the idea that if humans were kind of placed in an environment that was, let's say, more aligned with natural law, that it wouldn't result in flourishing, or that the powers that be would never relinquish control, or where do you see this being unrealistic?
Yeah, I think it's with the powers that be. I mean, they're obviously currently not relinquishing control. So, you know, I think that's what's making me feel that way.
Hmm. Anybody else have some thoughts? Martin, I know you like to get involved with social justice issues. Is this speaking your language at all, or?
As Tao said, it seems really, it speaks to the what it could, but it just seems very unrealistic. As you just said, like the thing how the powers that be would have a hard time releasing control, just like you see it, the feminism activism trying to release um, the overpower of men over women and control, and how a lot of men just seek it as a, well, I'm gonna be the hunted one and the oppressed one, and it's completely misguided in terms of the fear of losing control. We see it in a lot of politicians when they are called out for account to account for their actions, and they like, no, 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 this is definitely not it. I need to keep my seat. I need to be really re-electable. I it speaks a little bit to me in terms of, yes, it's the ideal situation. That's what we wanted to see, but it's just not really practical. I don't see it being executable in practice, or at least very hard to do so. And
Yeah.
like, as much as I hate it, I always think about Dumbledore talking about the power is best suited for those who never seek it. And like, I think there's a lot to that in terms of like the best leaders are those who just come naturally without wanting to be, and especially putting those who do not wish to be empowered to give it a shot, because they would have completely different takes and different approaches to the scenario, to the situation, than those who have thought a lot about keeping the power. They have put a lot of thought into how and when and what they need to do, and just coming from completely from the left field, just having someone who doesn't want to do that, just I think brings a lot of diversity, which I think is the key to the changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it for sure is a complicated issue. Curious what your thoughts are on the idea of, at the personal level of application, and or smaller groups striving to implement something along these lines. Is that a waste of time, or do you see value in that direction?
Well, just like this whole session, this whole series here, I think that this is why we're here, to seek some, different opinions or seek some other options. Is how can we do life differently? And on the very personal level, there is something, there is a lot we can do, and a lot of thoughts, food for thought, I should say, for us to consider. When it comes to even small groups, I think as soon as we start to group more than one person together, there is going to be a conflict. There is going to be a desire. There's going to be um, I won't say agenda, but there's going to be some sort of a fight between the two, or there's going to be or you're going to be, creating echo chambers, which also not good for general growth, right? Like, I think on an individual level, I think yes, But as soon as we start grouping together, there's going to be an element of power that's the problem.
Anybody else have some thoughts about personal application or small group application?
Jim, I came across a concept once of healing that I think maybe there's a parallel here, or not healing, but health, which is that in some sense, the state of perfect health is a state of not being aware of the body, in the sense that when you're just going around your day to day doing your stuff, you don't really notice your body. But if there's something wrong, you notice it. It hurts, or you feel it. And so when your body is functioning perfectly, you're not even aware that you have a body. You just do what you want to do. And it seems like there might be in the Daodejing somewhere a passage about how good government is not visible. It's like you're not the better the government works, the less you're aware of its functioning. It might be doing really significant, important things in the background, but it functions so well and efficiently that you're not aware of it. And it seems to me there might be like a parallel here, that it's that the better government functions, the less the people are aware of it functioning.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think one of the refrains you hear a couple of different times in the Daodejing is everybody saying, "Oh, we did this by ourselves." We did this. Yeah.
Yeah, it's that and the guy with the horse. It always comes down to that guy with the horse.
We'll see. Yeah. Yeah. I gotta say, there's so many people that just constantly bring that up to me about how helpful that. All right, guys.
Listen.
Well, we're at time today. I thought this was a fun discussion, a good close to the first section of the Tao. And next week, we'll pick it up with the opening chapter of Da. So again, thank you for coming. If you're watching this on video and you'd like to be a part of the live discussion, either on YouTube or in person, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe. And love to see you. All right, guys, take care.
Bye. Thanks, Jim.